Hi, I'm Michael Carr from Veritas Literary, and this is How to Hook an Agent. Today I'm going to talk about work that doesn't pay. Now, I'm not going to go through a lot of the other things that I've mentioned elsewhere, which is reading queries, evaluating manuscripts, doing conferences and other events that either don't pay or pay very little, because I'm going to cover those elsewhere. Today, I'm going to talk about the kind of work that I tend to decline when it's presented to me, even though it technically has some sort of commission attached to it. To explain a little bit of what this is, in addition to the very straightforward sort of work that people usually see, which is me selling a book, oftentimes a debut novel or a follow-up contract for someone who's already got some books under his or her belt, some additional things that I might do that have some financial compensation for me as an agent would include selling of foreign rights, selling of audio rights if we're able to hold those back. Same goes with foreign rights. A lot of times those are packaged in. And as well as doing some film and movie options. These are some of the things that might come up in my regular work. In fact, over the last couple of weeks, I've done 3 different movie options, which is a little bit of an unusual thing for me. Not that I don't do movie options, but that several of them have come out at the same time. One was for some short stories. I believe it was, if I'm remembering right, I think it was 4 short stories from a collection of somebody who I represent, of her other works that I represent. One was a renewal of a contract that was done a couple of years ago that has some interest, but because of the pandemic, the projects have been delayed a little bit, and the production team, if you will, the scouts, want to maintain their option and go forward again. And the third one was for a new release of one of my authors. The amount of money involved in these ranges from $500 on the low end to $3,500 on the high end. Those numbers are going to depend a lot upon the success of the project in question. If you're talking about for a smaller project or a book by a newer writer, you might be talking those sums of money. On the lower end, and if it's a bigger project, it could be significant. I'm sure if you were had a mega bestseller of the level of like The Hunger Games or something, and someone was going to be optioning that to be made into a movie, that option money would be serious money. And that's just the option, because of course, as you negotiate, if it starts to go into any sort of production or anything, usually there's an additional negotiation, or sometimes there are clauses that deal with that sort of contingency, and there can be a lot of money. Hollywood has a lot of money. Similarly, with audio rights, over the past few months, I have done a couple of fairly decent sized deals. And in one case, the audio rights that we managed to hold back went for more than the initial advance for print and ebook and foreign rights. In fact, the audio alone was significant. And if you've got a bigger property, foreign rights can go for a lot of money too. German rights especially seem to be lucrative. And a writer of mine, I didn't actually negotiate these because these were packaged in with the initial sale, which happens, but recently sold some rights to the Czech Republic and Italy for the book. So sometimes it's a hodgepodge. Usually there's some markets that are more acquisitive than others, but you can have all sorts of things. Like I have a writer who's been in like 17 different languages or something, and she'll get a small amount of money from Lithuania, and then a bigger amount of money from France, that sort of thing. So I will negotiate those sort of things when they come up. I have some experience. There have been a couple of times I've done deals with people separately in Europe, taking advantage of the fact that I have some foreign language experience too. One thing, however, that I don't tend to represent is books with smaller press houses. So, for example, if you had something that was offering $500 or $1,000, or sometimes people will get an offer for something that really just doesn't have any money involved, and they're looking to hire me as an agent to negotiate their contract, I won't do that. It's not that I'm incapable of looking at a contract, but there's not really any money in it, and I don't like to take money from people for working with the publishing industry. It feels like it's just me, but it feels like there's some kind of slippery slope ethical things. And when I have compensation for writing or editing related things, I want to keep them completely separate from agenting. And in part, this is because sometimes people will send certain agents will work with vanity presses and things where they're really getting a nice commission from the vanity press, which is not doing anyone any good. In addition, in the year 2021, I think an author is better off self-publishing in most cases than going with a non-advance paying publisher. I just don't think you can get that much benefit from it, and you're going to be tying up your rights. So I have a little bit of a philosophical disagreement with that. But apart from that, if I were to sell something for $1,000 to a small press and someone were to approach me with that, I have an offer on the table, there's really no money in that for me. And I personally am not going to represent anything that I haven't read or I'm not familiar with the work. So if someone wants to hire me on to go through a contract, which is probably going to be several hours of my time to go through the contract, negotiate the contract, try to strike out some features, and then deal with all the inevitable hassles of very small royalty payments and things like that, it just doesn't pay for me. So to give an example, if there was $1,000 involved, 15% of that would go to the agency, and then my personal arrangement is 80% of that goes to me personally. The other 20% goes to my colleague, the owner of the agency, who is compensated for her time managing paperwork and taxes and things like that, which is not necessarily my interest or my forte. So you'd be talking $120 to negotiate that, and it opens up the potential for a lot of work down the road. Now, having said that, if I'm out on submission with someone, I will try smaller presses, and I've had deals as small as $4,000 or $5,000 that I've worked with, and I'm happy to do that for reasons I'll explain in a little bit, assuming I don't get sidetracked and forget. So, something that happened to me recently was one of my existing authors who had a novella that she'd written that, let's say 30,000 words, wanted to know if I would submit that novella to some paying markets for her that were only taking submissions via agency. This was a tricky situation for me because it kind of falls in between not working with people who are not my writers and then doing things which are sometimes favors of looking at, I will look as a courtesy for writers I represent, their small press things or something on the side to just kind of, not to take a commission, but just kind of, I'll glance over this and make sure there's no like big red flags or anything. And this wasn't quite that because it's like 30,000 words. I started thinking about it. The markets in question, I looked them up, looked like they would pay between $500 and $2,000. Let's call it $1,500. There are only two markets in question, so it's not like with a novel or a nonfiction book-length project where I would start at a minimum of maybe 8 or 10 houses to go out, depending on the genre, and with a potential of 20 or more, 30 people perhaps to go out to if it's something that has a wider appeal and a larger number of people to publish it. So my odds are just way down. I thought best case scenario, I've got a 1 in 3 chance of placing this. I was really kind of looking at it in a little bit of a mercenary sort of a way. A 1 in 3 chance of placing this. So let's say the average on this was $1,500, right? So $1,500, 15% of that is what, $225. But I've got a 1 in 3 chance. So what is that? $75 would be my average take on this. Knock off 20% of that. So my expected take would be $60 if my 1 in 3 odds are correct. And it's probably, with so much competition and only 2 markets, probably more like 1 in 5. But let's say it was $60. Right, that's not a lot of money. How much time are we looking at? Well, realistically, I got to read the book. 30,000 words is still 30,000 words. Give some feedback. Read it again to make sure that it's ready to go. I don't go out with anything that I haven't given at least a few tweaks and things to. So I then have to write a pitch. I'm going to have to then negotiate a contract. I'm going to have to follow up for some indeterminate period of time on royalties and all of the inevitable difficulties. Writers who are like, why isn't this happening? Why isn't that happening? And, then eventually go and try to get the rights back. This is a smaller thing, and the writer will probably want to self-publish this or incorporate it into something else later. So what are we talking about? 20 hours maybe? Well, it's one thing to do a little bit of a favor for someone glancing through a short story contract and making sure there's nothing like no gotchas in there. It's another thing to take full responsibility and say, I'm going to do 20 hours of work for $60. It's $3 an hour, and probably 2/3 of the chance, or maybe 80% of the chance, it's nothing, and I do 10 or 12 hours, let's say. So it's just not a very good use of my time. Having said that, of course, if you had one of your biggest writers out there who's bringing in a lot of money, you have to do certain things like this. I'm not trying to be overly mercenary. I'm not in this. I didn't get into this, as I mentioned before, to make a lot of money, but nevertheless, it's a constant struggle to make a living between writing and freelance work and agenting. I'm putting in about 50 hours a week. If I had extra time, it would behoove me to go and find a new writer who has a lot of potential that I could go out with. When I signed that deal for $5,000 or $10,000, I was always hoping to get 30 or 40,000. And which brings me back to the point, which I didn't forget, but I almost forgot, which is why is it worthwhile for me to sell a $5,000 book? Well, for one thing, a lot of the work has already been done. I tried to get the bigger deals. I was hoping every once in a while you get a 6-figure deal. I was hoping for that. It didn't happen. That's where an agent has to make his or her living. And then I tried for progressively, until I got to a market that's a legit place, that's going to put out a good book, has some skin in the game in terms of their money, and also could possibly be a stepping stone for bigger things. One of my biggest name writers I represent started off with a contract that was under $10,000 per book. So still with the same publisher, making a lot more than that now, I can tell you. And so this is why the short story, there's no upside, there's no royalties, it's a flat fee. With a book, there's always the chance that it takes off and takes you up to the next level. The same sort of thing, like, why am I negotiating a $500 option? It's the same sort of math. I'm not going to make any money off of that. But it's a little bit like a lottery ticket that they pay you for. And if it's made into a movie, who knows? The sky is the limit on that, not to mention additional sales of the author's work. So it makes a lot of sense. And usually in those cases, people are approaching me about a project. And so even though individual things that I might work with, like a $4,000 book contract, is nothing to get super excited about, but I would be much more excited about doing that than a $2,000 short story, because there's somewhere to build from that. In most cases, writers can and should be able to submit their own work. I don't know why there are a few publishers out there that say they don't. I think they just don't want to get inundated with stuff. So I'm thinking of specifically places like tour.com, which And they do publish larger work, and it's a really nice paying marketplace for shorter work, but it's not great for me. So there's a little bit, unfortunately, of a disconnect. So I wrote to my author and said, I don't think I can do this. And I kind of laid out the math. I'm trying to be as transparent as I can going forward. There's a lot of finessing in here, and I thought about saying, well, I don't really have time. I don't really, but and it really does kind of come down to that. But I need to make a living at this, and I can't put 20 hours into a project that really has no financial upside for me. So being frank, if your agent tells you I don't do short stories, some of it is, and I usually say, well, I don't know the market, so I wouldn't be that great for it, which is true, but why do I not know the market? Well, it's because it doesn't pay, so I'm not going to investigate. I don't want to get into it. It's kind of cold hard math, but I'm going more and more towards being transparent. I would rather just be the one who tells people, here's what it is. And sometimes I have to tell people who give me their book, I don't think I can sell this. That's with an existing writer. That's really hard discussion to have, which I'll probably talk about in another video. But that's my selling point, I think, is that people know what they're going to get when someone hires me to give feedback on a query. I'm going to tell them why it doesn't work. If I get pitched, if it's not for me, I'm going to tell them that. And I'm going to try to answer my queries. I'm going to try to get back to people, but it sometimes means being a little bit blunt in a way that's uncomfortable for me and uncomfortable for other people. But it's never done with any sense of malice or laziness or anything like that. So that's all. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into a couple of aspects of the agenting world.